Today, I would like to give the regulator's perspective on the clinical evaluation of orphan medical devices. As mentioned, I was the lead author of the MDCG guidance on orphan medical devices, which will be the focus of my presentation today. So in this presentation, I will start by discussing the European medical device regulatory landscape, the medical device coordination group, and the orphan device task force that created this guidance. I'll give an overview on the guidance itself and its general contents. I'll discuss the orphan device status and how to justify that your device meets that status. I'll also cover the considerations on the clinical aspects outlined in the guidance. And finally, I will discuss briefly some supports and responsibilities provided by both notified bodies and the European Medicines Agency expert panels. So let's start with the MDR and the MDCG Orphan Device Task Force. As with all medical devices, orphan devices are subject to the medical device regulation, the MDR. As you may know, this regulation is mandatory across the EU and applies to all medical devices across all risk categories. Given how broad this regulation is, its principles are very high level, and there are no specific guidance or specifications for orphan devices in the regulation. So guidance was needed on how to apply the MDR to orphan devices. To that end, the MDCG set up an orphan device task force. The MDCG is the Medical Device Coordination Group, which is a group established under the MDR and composed of representatives from regulators of every European member state and is chaired by the European Commission. The aim of the task force was to develop specific guidance and consider the supports that could be available to orphan devices. The task force included representatives from regulators across Europe and the European Medicines Agency and the European Commission. It also included external stakeholders such as notified bodies, industry, healthcare professionals, and observers from the European Patients Forum. The Orphan Device Task Force developed the guidance document MDCG 2024-10. This guidance focuses on the clinical evaluation of orphan devices and devices with orphan indications. The guidance is directed towards manufacturers and notified bodies and is relevant to all orphan devices across all risk classes. So moving on to the guidance itself. The guidance is broken down into four main sections. First, there is an introductory section explaining the scope and the aim of the guidance. It also outlines the criteria for orphan device status and orphan indications and provides guidance on how to meet those criteria. Part A of the body of the guidance gives specific considerations on the clinical evaluation of these devices. It goes into detail about understanding when it might be acceptable to have limitations in pre-market clinical data. It provides guidance on the role of non-clinical data and offers guidance on legacy orphan devices, that is, orphan devices that have been on the market since before the MDR was enacted in 2021. There's also guidance on how to generate pre-market clinical data for orphan devices and the role of post-market clinical data collection, specifically PMCF and PMS. Part B gives considerations on the more procedural aspects, specifically the responsibilities of notified bodies, as well as the involvement of expert panels and the supports that they can provide. Finally, the appendices complement the clinical evaluation sections. They provide specific guidance on what should be included in the clinical evaluation report for orphan devices, considerations on conducting clinical investigations for orphan devices, and the role of extrapolation of clinical data in the context of certain orphan indications, which I'll explain later. So just to speak on the orphan device status. So a device can achieve orphan device status if it meets two specific criteria, one quantitative and one qualitative. The first quantitative criterion specifies that it must be specifically intended to benefit patients in the treatment, diagnosis, or prevention of a disease or condition that presents in not more than 12,000 individuals in the EU per year. Now, this figure of 12,000 is based on the US FDA's humanitarian use device designation, which is quite similar to the orphan device concept in the EU. And so that figure from the US system is extrapolated to the EU population, which equates to not more than 12,000 individuals. The second qualitative criterion states that it needs to show that there are insufficient available alternative options for the treatment, diagnosis, or prevention of the disease or condition, or that the device will offer an option that provides an expected clinical benefit compared to any available alternatives, or the state of the art, taking into consideration certain device and patient-specific factors, such as anatomical variations, which I'll speak more on later on. So guidance is given in the document on how to meet these criteria. With respect to epidemiology, for some rare diseases, it might be difficult to find precise figures or population estimates on the annual incidence in the EU. However, information on the prevalence of the disease may already be available in line with the EU definition of a rare disease, which, as I'm sure you know, is a prevalence of not more than 5 per 10,000 persons. So, if precise information about the annual incidence of a disease is unavailable, but it is expected that fewer than 12,000 patients will use the device per year, and you can show that the condition meets the EU definition of a rare disease, i.e., a prevalence of less than 5 per 10,000, this might be sufficient for justifying the quantitative criterion. We've deliberately tried to be a little bit flexible and pragmatic about that because we appreciate how hard it can be to justify that sometimes. We also acknowledge the role of orphan subpopulations. This is where there may be a rare orphan subgroup of patients within a larger non-orphan disease or condition. One example of this might be surgical closure in infancy of a patent ductus arteriosus, the PDA. In this situation, while PDA is a very common condition, the subgroup of patients who have a hemodynamically significant PDA requiring intervention is comparatively small, and a subgroup within that of those that are refractory to drug-based therapies and therefore need surgical intervention is rarer still. So feasibly, it's feasible to see that small group of patients who need surgical intervention for PDA would be an orphan subpopulation within a non-orphan broader population. To meet the qualitative criterion, you need to show that, as I mentioned, that you have adequately searched that for any potential alternatives and that you've tried to search to see if any exist, and you need to justify that there are no sufficient alternatives available. Or you need to justify that your device is superior to any alternatives in terms of clinical benefit. It should be noted that this doesn't mean that an orphan device gets market exclusivity, and that'd be quite different, say, to the drug system, where orphan drugs can get market exclusivity as part of their initial market access. For orphan devices, there may be alternatives for some groups within a population, but those may be less effective for a certain reason, or maybe less effective for a certain anatomical variation. Alternatively, there may be a situation where the alternative is not available in specific EU countries. The alternative manufacturer may not have the capacity to distribute their alternative device to every country in the EU, and so there may remain an unmet need for some patients in the EU. Evidence needs to be presented to justify that a device has an expected clinical benefit above the state of the art or any alternatives. This needs to take into account device-specific and patient-specific factors. For example, an orphan device could be intended to treat a specific anatomical variation in a valvular disease, say a particularly dilated valve, where other devices operate within this field but are not as effective. Finally, some devices may have more than one intended purpose. They may have an intended purpose for a specific orphan population, and they may have a different intended purpose for a non-orphan population. For example, we've seen situations where a device might be intended for a common adult disease, but say a smaller version or model of the device may be specifically intended for an orphan or pediatric disease. It's rarer. In those situations, it might be appropriate to extrapolate some of the clinical data from the adult population to support the orphan or pediatric indication. I'll discuss this later on in the presentation briefly. So to touch on the clinical considerations, one consideration is regarding the acceptability of limitations in pre-market clinical data. By the very nature of orphan devices, there is a very small target population for which you can conduct clinical investigations or carry out pre-market clinical data collection. This makes it very challenging to generate sufficient evidence for conformity assessment purposes. Therefore, limitations in pre-market clinical data might be acceptable if it can be justified that all available non-clinical and clinical data have been evaluated, and any limitations identified, any limitations in that data have been identified by the manufacturer. The existing data is sufficient to demonstrate that the relevant general safety and performance requirements are sufficiently met, and the GSPRs are outlined in Annex 1 of the MD order, which you may already be familiar with. The data also needs to be sufficient to show that there's an acceptable benefit-risk ratio, and that the use of the device is expected to provide a meaningful clinical benefit. It also needs to be justified that it is not feasible or proportionate to generate more clinical data in the pre-market setting. It needs to be shown that there is a robust and prescriptive PMCF plan, post-market clinical follow-up plan, that will fully address any limitations in pre-market clinical data that have been identified, and that plan needs to address those limitations within an appropriate time frame. And finally, users need to be adequately informed that a device is an orphan device and it meets that status, and they need to be informed on how to report any issues that may occur during use of the device. The guidance provides information on the role of non-clinical data, which is any data that does not meet the MDR definition of clinical data. While the MDR specifies that clinical evaluation needs to be based on clinical data, non-clinical data can play a supportive role in the context of orphan devices in establishing the acceptable level of safety, performance, and benefit risk for these devices. It can also help reduce the burden of pre-market clinical data requirements, and many GSPRs could potentially be met with robust preclinical testing, which could in turn reduce the burden of pre-market clinical data that is needed. Strong and robust and favorable preclinical data might also help strengthen the argument to justify CE marking with limitations on clinical data. As mentioned before, post-market surveillance and PMCF is extremely important for orphan devices, especially if there are limitations in pre-market clinical data. And so there is an increased reliance on timely post-market collection of clinical data for orphan devices. Therefore, the manufacturer needs to create a detailed, structured PMCF plan that explains the type of data that will be generated in the post-market setting, explains how the PMCF data will be generated within an appropriate time frame, and how it will address any of those pre-market limitations in clinical data that have been identified. It should include projections on the number of patients likely to use the device in the post-market setting, and there should be predefined milestones for the periodic analysis of post-market studies. Examples of PMCF activities that might be useful include PMCF investigations, PMCF studies, registries, registry-based studies, and real-world data collection. So with respect to legacy orphan devices and off-label use, in some exceptional cases, a legacy device might have been systematically used off-label for an orphan indication over many years across the EU. Even though this was not originally intended by the manufacturer, it may have become established by clinicians as the best clinical practice for that orphan condition. And this could be supported by scientific publications or expert clinical guidance and real-world data. In this context, there might be a lack of equipoise in the clinical community regarding this clinical use. They may have already deemed that it is beneficial, and therefore it might not be appropriate to have to conduct additional clinical investigations on the use on that orphan use for the legacy device. With that in mind, it may be acceptable to consider previous off-label use data for expanding intended purposes of legacy orphan devices if the decision to not perform a clinical investigation is justified and compliant with MDR requirements. The off-label use clinical data is of sufficient quality and quantity to allow clinical evaluation and notified body assessment. And the PMCF plan is designed to build on the off-label clinical data to confirm its continued acceptance and acceptable safety and performance for that orphan indication. Moving on, the guidance gives some description on the challenges related to carrying out clinical investigations of orphan devices. One challenge relates to choosing an appropriate study design, particularly when you have a small population you're trying to study. While a double-blind randomized control trial is preferred, dividing a small sample size into two arms, intervention and control, can prolong the study while trying to recruit enough eligible patients, which could in turn delay study completion. And that could potentially have knock-on effects that it's further delaying patient access to a device that they need, particularly when they lack alternatives. So there might also be challenges in blinding patients or clinicians in a study, particularly for devices where there are no alternatives. A lack of alternatives might also impact the study's equipoise for the purposes of selecting a control arm. When sampling from a small population, Recruiting enough patients can be challenging. If the inclusion criteria are too narrow, this will lead to a very slow recruitment. But if too broad, the group can be very heterogeneous, which could compromise the data robustness. Additionally, many orphan devices are intended for vulnerable populations, such as children, which brings its own challenges. There are challenges in selecting the best objectives and endpoints for pre-market studies of orphan devices. For example, should the focus be on short-term or long-term outcomes, on safety or performance or clinical benefit? While there may be data supporting short-term outcomes, it may be difficult to generate sufficient clinical data for long-term performance of the device in the pre-market setting, and that might have to be moved to the post-market setting. Researchers might also wonder about the role of surrogate endpoints for these patients, and how should researchers analyze statistically this data that is collected potentially from a limited sample size. So there's a lot of particular unique challenges for these type of studies. With that in mind, the document gives guidance on several aspects of clinical investigations for orphan devices. First, study design. As I mentioned, a randomized control trial is preferable, although it is acknowledged that other alternative study designs may be suitable, specifically case control trials that aren't randomized, or crossover studies where the patients act as their own control, and certain adaptive and sequential designs might be suitable as well. The choice of comparator and control is discussed in our guidance, and while concurrent matched controls are preferred if possible, the choice of comparator arm may be challenging in the absence of alternatives. State-of-the-art and sham may be appropriate controls, and there may be situations where comparing patients to historic controls might be the most appropriate approach. In some circumstances, a single-arm observational study might also be acceptable. Regarding the population, researchers should make efforts to ensure that the population that is evaluated and included in the investigation is representative of the orphan disease. As mentioned, you need to strike a balance between having a sufficiently broad set of inclusion criteria while avoiding too much heterogeneity that could compromise the clinical data quality. And naturally, this is a balance that needs to be made on a case-by-case basis, and it is hard to give granular guidance on that in a guidance document. If you are investigating vulnerable populations, you do need to be conscious of the MDR requirements for certain vulnerable populations like minors or incapacitated patients. These are outlined in the medical device regulation, articles 64 to 68. It's just good to be aware of them. When selecting objectives in the pre-market setting, the primary objectives should focus on short to medium-term clinical benefit and safety. Additional objectives should also focus on the short to medium-term performance and technical success for the device. Safety monitoring is also highly important in these studies, particularly given the vulnerable nature of the population. Generally, you should consider including a data safety monitoring board and/or clinical events committee, if appropriate, with specific stopping boundaries. Regarding endpoints, disease-specific endpoints are preferable, but it is appropriate at times to use validated surrogate endpoints, particularly in the pre-market setting. These can be very useful. Patient-reported outcome measures might also be appropriate as supportive endpoints, acknowledging that they can be vulnerable to bias. Regarding statistical analysis, while traditional frequentist approaches are valuable and valid, we appreciate that these might end up being more descriptive in nature rather than inferential, given that studies may be quite small in terms of their sample size. You can also consider the role of Bayesian or hybrid Bayesian approaches, particularly if you are dealing with small populations where you have a certain amount of prior information. It may be relevant. Finally, for PMCF studies, the focus should be more on long-term safety, performance, and clinical benefit, reflecting the device's life cycle. While double-blinded randomized control trials for post-market studies are encouraged, in some situations, single or unblinded randomized control trials might be acceptable, as well as potentially observational cohort studies in some cases, depending on the level of pre-market clinical data that there was. There are interesting, less common study designs that could be considered as well, such as registry-based randomized control trials. These are often called nested trials, and they can be quite useful in the post-market setting. Concurrent match controls are again strongly encouraged for PMCF studies, and where possible for any PMCF study, you should endeavor to recruit a representative proportion of the relevant patients that attend, say, that health center or that investigational site. So ideally, you should be aiming for greater than 90% at least invitation for recruitment amongst this patient population, given how small the sample size is. So moving on, as mentioned previously, it may be appropriate to extrapolate clinical data collected from non-orphan indications for the purposes of supporting an orphan indication. For example, extrapolating adult data to pediatric indications. This depends on several factors, namely the relevance of the data to the orphan indication, the quality of that data, and the extent to which the extrapolated data can provide sufficient clinical evidence for that orphan indication. Our guidance explains two different types of extrapolation as concepts. There's partial extrapolation, where the data can be used in combination with other sources to provide sufficient clinical evidence. Generally, the extrapolated data is not sufficient on its own, and it may need to rely on statistical models or other combinations of data that can make inferences to support the orphan indication. There's also full extrapolation. This is where extrapolated data might be sufficient as the main or sole source of clinical data to act as essentially a complete substitute for providing sufficient clinical evidence for that orphan indication. In this situation, very little additional clinical data is needed for the initial certification, and maybe it might be sufficient to generate additional data in the post-market setting. However, it is important to note that in reality, full extrapolation is expected to be rarer than partial extrapolation in this context of orphan devices. The guidance outlines the steps on how you should take to decide whether your extrapolated data can be used. Generally, the 4 steps to take are, and 4 questions to ask are: is the clinical data relevant for the orphan population? Is it expected that the differences between the orphan and non-orphan populations could actually impact the device's safety or performance and thereby impact the robustness of the data? Do the extrapolated data provide sufficient clinical evidence on its own for the orphan indication, i.e. full extrapolation? And if not, are the data suitable for use as part of the clinical evidence, i.e. partial extrapolation? The guidance gives much more granular information and a flowchart within the Appendix A3 on further questions and further means of determining these 4 questions. I won't go to it in detail today in the interest of time, but I encourage you to have a read of particularly the Appendix 3 of that guidance. So moving on to the more procedural elements, I'll briefly speak on some of the notified body responsibilities. So the notified body is encouraged to engage with manufacturers of orphan devices prior to certification in structured dialogues early on to support the manufacturers in navigating the regulatory system. They can provide guidance and advice on whether the device meets the actual orphan device status. They can also help set expectations for what might be required in general for a clinical evaluation perspective and the clinical development strategy for an orphan device. During certification, notified bodies are encouraged to consider the role of conditions or specific provisions of certification. It might be acceptable to certify these devices for placement on the market on the condition that they conduct specific PMCF studies or other PMCF activities, or they might require manufacturers to include specific information for users. These are just examples of conditions of certification that could be considered by the notified body. Once the device is placed on the market, the notified bodies will have a responsibility for monitoring the post-market clinical follow-up activities of the manufacturer and the device. This would include regular reassessment of the clinical evaluation as it is updated based on new data collected in the post-market setting. And additionally, the notified body will need to verify that there is continued favorable benefit risk profile for the orphan device and ensure that the manufacturer is complying with the conditions of certification. Finally, I would like to speak on the role of the EMA expert panels. So the expert panels, for those who don't know, are a series of panels manned by clinical experts in specific fields such as orthopedics or cardiovascular. Expert panels are able to give early scientific advice to certain orphan device manufacturers if requested, such as high-risk orphan devices as outlined in MD Article 61.2. Generally, eligible manufacturers should consider this early on in their device development, and they should consider getting advice from the relevant expert panels, which could give them a good steer with respect to the clinical development of the clinical evidence needed. These panels will be able to assess and give their opinion on the orphan device status, as well as provide feedback on the manufacturer's clinical development strategy. They are also encouraged to give feedback on whether the proposed clinical investigations, both pre-market and post-market, might be acceptable for the device in question. Expert panels can also be useful in the more advanced pre-market stages, particularly with respect to giving scientific advice to notified bodies and manufacturers for legacy orphan devices. They can again provide support by assessing the orphan device status, as well as reviewing the clinical evaluation that's been done to date. They can give opinions on the acceptability of any limited clinical data and clinical uncertainty for the purposes of placement on the market, as well as give opinions on the acceptability of the manufacturer's PMCF plan to address and close out those limitations in the post-market setting. So to conclude, we as EU regulators acknowledge that orphan medical devices play a critical role in the delivery of healthcare in Europe. They have an important role in the management and diagnosis of specific rare diseases. The orphan device status has now been defined within the EU based on quantitative and qualitative criteria, and we acknowledge the status and potential role for orphan indications. Limitations in clinical data for these devices may be acceptable, provided that the GSPORs are met, the benefit-risk profile is acceptable, and there is evidence of expected clinical benefit. It must also be justified that further pre-market clinical data generation is unfeasible, and that the PMCF plan is well-defined and adequate. Users will also need to be adequately informed of the orphan device status. Other clinical investigations for orphan device manufacturers to consider include the role of non-clinical data, off-label use data for legacy devices, and the extrapolation of data for orphan indications. Guidance is also given on designing and conducting pre- and post-market clinical investigations. Finally, we've outlined how notified bodies and expert panels can interact with orphan device manufacturers to provide supports and advice, including structured notified body dialogues and expert panel scientific advice and opinions. So thank you very much for your time. I hope this has been helpful, and I'm very happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary. That was super interesting, and I think it was super clear and provided a lot of very important information how these new guidance can provide support to manufacturers, researchers also when they are developing the clinical strategic development plan, and also to the startups working in the field, and also as an opportunity, to have this support from the European Commission with the EMA as well, and how to move forward with the developments. I don't know if there are any questions in the audience. I do have some, but I prefer to give some space to the people who joined today. If there is something you would like to ask, just open your mic, open your camera. You can, so we can also see you. Nothing.
I clearly was too comprehensive.
Yeah. Well, I have a couple of questions, Gary, that I would like to ask you. Yesterday, we have a very interesting meeting with a company regarding the orphan device designation, and how to obtain the ODD and the impact that it can have also when you need to raise some funds from private investors, because there are some incentives in market exclusivity, etc. And they explained it as something that I didn't know and was very interesting. And I think it's I also wanted to ask you for the orphan devices. They told us yesterday that in order to get the orphan device designation, the drug designation, the orphan drug designation, the designation was not for the for the disease itself, but for the reason going to a disease. I don't know if I'm explaining. For example, we were talking about exactly. It was not on the it was on the indication of the disease, but not on the disease itself. And I don't know if with this, in this case, with the orphan device designation as well, it's the same vision, or it's more in the commercial intended use of the device.
Well, it's not just the disease itself. I suppose that is an important factor. It's more so the use within the disease. I think, yes, I think the guidance gives detail on rare diseases, and particularly, devices are intended for the treatment of rare diseases. But I suppose, as I mentioned, the EU law, or the EU number figure for rare diseases is 1 in 10,000, less than 1 in 10,000 prevalence. In our guidance, as I mentioned, our main number is figured on that the device will be used in fewer than 12,000 patients in the EU per year. So it's more of an incidence, and that's the way the FDA uses it for their devices. But it is, I think, the way that the MDR is written, it's very much focuses on the intended purpose of the device rather than the indications. While indications are included, it's much more about the intended purpose. So when we're operating within the understanding of the MDR, that's why we focused principally on that. And I think, as far as as far as sentiment is considered, it makes more sense that it's about the fact that as a manufacturer, you're not expecting to use this device very frequently in Europe. So that's why it's difficult to, if they say costs associated with placement on the market, it might be very, very hard to regain that investment, and that is particularly challenging when you have a rare patient population that you're treating. So the rare disease is one aspect of it, but acknowledging that it might be potential that a rare subgroup of a non-rare disease might be relevant, but the focus is on the intended purpose, how that device is planning to be used, and it's being used in a rare group of intended purposes.
That's very interesting. Thank you, Gary. And if there are no more questions, I also have something else I would like to ask you. Also, I think that there is a question here. Let's go to the chat. So Marlon says, hello, what are the main regulatory challenges for the approval of medical devices that incorporate artificial intelligence and computer vision in the European Union? Are there specific considerations in the clinical evaluation of these devices?
Thanks very much. I suppose it's a little bit outside of orphan devices, particularly AI. But as I mentioned, I am as you kindly mentioned at the beginning, I also am part of the MDCG Taskforce on breakthrough devices, which is very linked to sort of innovative aspects. There's also within the MDCG a large separate working group called the New Technologies Working Group. And one of their areas of focus is artificial intelligence and medical device software. The MDCG a couple of years back created guidance, two actually quite useful guidance documents on, first of all, the qualification of medical device software, and then the clinical evaluation of medical device software, which would be relevant to AI. So I can type in the names, but it's MDCG 2020-19-11 is the qualification and classification, and 2020-1 is the clinical evaluation of medical device software. It's definitely something within the breakthrough task force we've acknowledged, that there is a particular challenge, I suppose, as regulators, and in the whole spectrum, it's sort of almost like an area of unknown trying to place medical device AI software on the market, and that's certainly something we're trying to address. It's not just the MDR, the medical device regulation, or you might find AI devices in the in vitro diagnostic world, sort of IVDs, because there's a separate legislation on that called IVDR. But separate to those, there's also, of course, the AI Act, and they might have an aspect as well as certain, the general data protection regulation as well. So there are a few challenges, and there's a lot of moving parts, and I can sympathize with device innovators trying to place devices on that market. It's certainly an area of focus we're doing. So I would advise maybe provisionally for the clinical evaluation of software would be to refer to the MDCG guidance documents on clinical evaluation of of software, as well as actually some other aspects of, they have guidance on software that's integrated within a hardware device rather than, say, a standalone software. So there are a few quite useful guidance documents, and I can link the landing page for those guidance documents for your perusal. I think that could be useful for you.
Yeah, I think that will be super useful for to have access to the guidance. I don't know if there are more questions from the people.
That there is the landing page. So on that page you can find basically any piece of guidance document created by the medical device coordination group, and you'll see there are a lot already in lots of different aspects, but there's one specific, you'll be able to find medical device software guidance within that, and as I mentioned, it's a 2020-1 is the one specific to clinical evaluation of medical device software.
Perfect. Thank you, Gearóid. Thank you so much. And well, if there are no more questions, my last question will be a little bit related as well to the incentives of the orphan drug designation. Now we have seen that there are some incentives for the companies, like this market exclusivity, the extension of the intellectual property protection, etc. Do you think that there could be new incentives to come also in the area of devices, as it has been done in the area of drugs?
It's a great question. So when we were creating the guidance, we had to operate within the MDR as written, and I suppose, as for those who know, the MDR doesn't allow for the concept of market exclusivity, and there isn't any predefined MDR legislation on, say, an orphan device legislative pathway, a separate pathway. So in order to do that, there'd have to be a change made to the legislation. Now, it is a priority area. The European Commission has identified both orphan devices and breakthrough technologies as areas of priority, and they are undergoing what's called a targeted evaluation of the MDR and the IVDR. This was put into effect in 2021, the MDR, and so since then we've sort of collected enough information and understood how it works that maybe it was kind of always anticipated that there might need to be adjustments and changes and amendments made to the legislation, and I would speculate that could be something that could be considered. There's also a constraint here, because you say for reducing fees. We can reduce the public fees, like say associated with expert panels or regulators, in authorizing clinical investigations. But for notified bodies, because notified bodies are themselves independent legal entities, that they are businesses themselves, we can't impose them to say have to reduce their fees and things like that. Now that is a tension in a decentralized system like this, where we're not like the drug system, where the EMA is a public sector centralized authorization body. When you have this decentralized landscape with private entities giving the authorizations, this is a tension. It's very hard as regulators to impose things like that, and understandably so. So that is something I suppose I think the Commission are looking into as part of their focused legislation. So I would almost watch this space and see what can be done in that regard.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Gearóid. Well, if there are no more questions, I just want to thank you very much for today's session. I think it was very valuable and a lot of new information. I think Cristina has a question.
Yeah, sorry, because I have not my camera and I'm driving, and maybe the connection is not so good, and maybe I missed part of the great talk. But I would like to ask a specific question about the what is considered orphan device. Since it is a very specific question, because we are working with a device that monitors some parameters, and the intended use of this device is to measure these parameters in a specific population that is an orphan population, because our congenital heart disease pediatric patients, but and we thought that maybe could be considered orphan device. However, this device is able to measure these parameters also in adult population and in other indications, and we wonder if in this case the device would be considered orphan medical device or not.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for the question. I think so. As mentioned, if you have two indications, one for adult and one for pediatric, or one for non-orphan and another for an orphan, it might fall into that concept of an orphan indication, which is outlined in the guidance document. The device itself may itself not be an orphan device because it might have non-orphan indications, but for the purposes of the orphan indication, it our guidance basically advises that the principles of, say, clinical data collection can be applied for that orphan indication. Obviously, that's without prejudice or independent of you having to justify and have evidence for the non-orphan indication, but that's where the role, say, of data extrapolation could be useful from your non-orphan into orphan. But as far as specifically asking for your own device, whether or not your device is or is not an orphan device, my recommendation would be to engage either with, if you have engaged with a notified body, speak with them through a structured dialogue, or even more, possibly even more valuably, is engage with the expert panel in an early scientific advice, the European EMA expert panels. So again, it depends on the field that you'll be working within, but I believe the European Commission has a landing page and they can direct you there. But those would be your two avenues for your device specifically.
Great, thanks. Thank you. Thank you so much.
No problem, you're welcome.
Perfect. Thank you, Chris, for the question. And well, as I was saying, thank you so much for today's session and for bringing all the new work that you have been part of this new guidance. I think it's very valuable. And also thank you very much to the people who joined the session, and we'll be with more content in the next training capsules.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. We'll stay in touch, Gearóid. Thank you.
Absolutely. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.